Our next speaker is someone who I've known for many years and has just had a fabulous career herself. Her bio is in the book. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I'm very glad to see her family here, and especially her daughter, Madeline. I'm going to tell a little story about Madeline. When she was a little bit younger, and we were in the when we were stationed together in the Pentagon. She came in, and Linell introduced her to me, and she kind of looked me up and down and said, "Mom, aren't there any girl generals or women generals?" I didn't quite make the cut of general officer stuff in Madeline's view. But there's a million stories about Linell, and I remember she worked as kind of a speechwriter, and we had a very important speech. I'm not even sure if you remember this one, Linell. It was down at the JAG school. And so we're kind of down in the blue room, and their equivalent down there. And we're sitting across from each other, and Linell's looking, like staring at me. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. She's like staring at me, and I could read her mind. It was in her mind, can this guy do this, or is he going to screw up my speech? And I had to say, Linell, I can do this. And then there was one other short story. Linell is a very strong woman. She has no trouble making decisions. And once she makes a decision, she's not inflexible, but you better have a darn good reason if you don't agree with her. And I remember when we were moving stuff around the Pentagon, she was orchestrating the whole damn thing. And I go into my office, and I see this bookcase over, and the sergeant was there. And I said, oh, no, I don't want the bookcase there. I went over here. He goes, sir, okay, I'll move it. But you need to know Major Letendre doesn't want it there. We both looked at each other for a couple of seconds. I said, leave it where it is, wherever she. No further ado, Linell.
Well, thank you very much, General Dunlap. I have the coveted position of being the last speaker and the one that all the lawyers in the room are only here because they need their in-live ethics presentation for their state bar. So with that, not true, sir. Well, thank you, sir. I'm glad the Admiral's here just because he's interested in the topic, so I appreciate that. For everyone else, I commit that this will be unlike most ethics presentations that you sit through, and with that, I thought we'd start with a joke. There was a lawyer and an engineer and even a commander who all met at the pearly gates of heaven, and their only requirement to get through the gates was that they learn to speak and be able to speak the same language with respect to cyber or autonomous weapon systems. Query, how long did it take them to get through the pearly gates? Well, while this may sound like the beginning of a trite joke, the sad and unfortunate aspect is that all too often lawyers and policymakers' eyes start to glaze over as engineers begin speaking about reliability, control theory, open architecture design. And engineers tune out at the mere mention of international law and go simply into a comatose state if we start throwing around Latin phrases. But with the growing utilization of robotics and cyber and autonomous weapon systems on the battlefield, lawyers and engineers must learn to speak the same language, or at the very least, understand the basics of each other's worlds. Why the imperative? Why can't engineers keep designing systems based on operator requirements and lawyers just keep evaluating the legality of weapon systems prior to implementation? Well, the simple answer is that robotics is different. We heard yesterday about this idea of the third offset strategy or the latest revolution in military affairs. And I truly believe that both cyber and autonomous weapons, those two interconnected realms, have the potential to move the human operator further and further out of the control loop and leave more and more of the decisions up to a machine. The catch is that international law and the rules governing the law of armed conflict were written to be implemented by and through people, not machines. Translating the legal requirements for use of force cannot be an afterthought in this arena. Instead, we must have more engineers who understand the international law requirements to build that in from the beginning. We also need lawyers who understand the technical limitations of autonomy or cyber weapons. The more we understand, the more likely we are to develop weapon systems that comply with the law. So my premise here today is that understanding technology is an ethical requirement, an ethical obligation for attorneys and policymakers in the realm of national security law. Now, I'll repeat that proposition, that understanding technology is an ethical requirement that we have in this realm. And while an attorney need not be qualified to necessarily design the system, he or she should at least be able to stay with the conversation surrounding robotics, autonomy, or cyber weapons, and to have meaningful dialogue with our operators and our designers. So to support this proposition, today we're going to walk through a number of things. First, we're going to talk about some of the ABA model rules that I think apply to this proposition. And for the non-lawyers in the audience, I ask that you bear with us. This is the requirement that we have to get through in order to give all the lawyers in the room their magical 1 hour of credit, of ethics credit. But then we'll explore a practical approach to understanding the techie stuff. And yes, that's a scientific term. The understanding that issue, and we'll use the example of autonomous weapon systems as our primary means for two reasons. The first reason is that it happens to be the technology that I understand, and therefore it's probably a good thing if I talk about the technology that I inherently understand, vice that of cyber. And number two, it's an unfettered attempt to try to convince General Dunlap to have his next Lens event talk about autonomy, and therefore I can be invited back again. But I'm confident that in talking about autonomous systems, that it will translate well for many of the cyber folks here in the room, because we'll be discussing some of the basic building blocks that quite frankly overlap between robotics and the cyber world. I'll also explain why understanding that technology is fundamental for an attorney in giving or proffering that sound legal advice. And we'll even give you some questions to ask the engineers and the techie folks as we go through. So without further ado, let's walk into the model rules. I guess I should also repeat, although General Dunlap indicated yesterday that those of us in uniform are in no way representing the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, or in my case, the United States Air Force Academy, it bears repeating that everything I'm about to say is my own personal opinion and my own personal views. So let's start with the model ethical rules that support this proposition that we have to understand technology. And no ethics brief would be complete without starting at our foundational principle, that of Rule 1.1 and the idea of competency. So a lawyer shall provide competent representation to a client. Well, how does this relate to technology? Well, competency in the realm of national security law, I believe, requires a fundamental understanding of technology's capabilities and limitations prior to us opining about the proper uses thereof. The model rules actually go on to describe a relationship with technology, specifically in Comment 8 of the Model ABA rules that was promulgated in 2012. It says that a lawyer must keep abreast of changes in law and its practice, including the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. Now, I'm sure we all know that this likely came about because the lawyer made some stumbling errors when learning about metadata or the aspect of cloud computing and really goofed up, which is why we must have a comment in this regard. But over half of the states actually have a comment essentially to this effect that indicates that we have to understand technology and how it might relate to our practice of law. In addition, Rule 1.3 is a gentle reminder about diligence, or that a lawyer shall act with reasonable diligence and promptness in representing a client. I fully realize that talking about technology is not something that comes easy to lawyers. We didn't exactly go to school because we liked math, or at least some of us didn't. But diligence reminds us that it takes hard work and stick-to-itiveness, even in the area of technology, and that we have an ethical obligation to do just that. The final model rule that I'll go through today is that of Rule 2.1, or a reminder about what our scope of requirements are as an advisor. That rule states that in representing a client, a lawyer shall exercise independent, professional judgment and render candid advice. So why do I think this relates to technology? Well, for two reasons. First, that independent nature of our advice means that the little hairs on the back of your neck need to know when they need to stand up when you're in a room of operators or engineers and they're talking about some technical aspects. If you don't understand enough about the technology about which you are listening to, your hairs on the back of your neck don't know when to go up. You don't know when to apply that independent, candid judgment. And therefore, I think it is incumbent upon all of us to learn a thing or two about technology such that we are competent in our representation and able to provide our independent professional judgment. Second, there is a comment to this ABA model rule that says and reminds us that advice couched in narrow legal terms may be of little to no use to our clients. This means that if all we're good at is understanding the particular law in our given area, we might not be able to translate that in a manner that our clients understand. And therefore, pure technical legal advice can sometimes be inadequate. I believe this is especially true in the area of national security law and concerns about operational law issues, where advice given with little to no understanding of that technical capability about new or emerging systems is of little use to our client. I would submit that the model rules are more cognizant of technology than we might give them credit for. One only has to scratch the surface behind many of the states' approach to Model Rule 1.6, which, as the lawyers in the room know, deal with confidentiality and privileged communication. Of the states that have addressed it, they've all indicated that there's a responsibility or a standard of reasonable care to prevent unintended disclosure. And more states are talking about the relationship between unintended disclosure and that of technology. Up here you see California, and in 2010, one of their model ethics opinions went through and listed a variety of factors used to decide whether or not reasonable care had been exercised by an attorney in a given situation. It should not come as a shock to anyone in this room, given the wealth of knowledge about cyber, that over half of the factors that they listed had something to do with technology. I've listed them here today. I'll talk briefly about this last comment, the last factor listed, that an attorney's own level of technological competence is a factor in determining whether or not reasonable care was used. Well, lest you think that the takeaway from this is that attorneys can just go bury their head in the sand and if I don't have technological competence, then I'll be okay. The factor goes on to describe that if you lack that competence, you better get an expert to help you out in this field. Otherwise, you might not be found to have exercised reasonable care. I was especially pleased to hear about the Coast Guard, for example, in yesterday's discussion, that they have required their individuals, in fact, all of their JAGs, to have a basic understanding about cyber and about cyber awareness. This is one type of example of understanding the technological competence. And I think we can look outside the model rules to other rules, and to that extent I'll draw upon or elaborate on some of this talk we heard yesterday afternoon from Professor Watts and Colonel Korn concerning the Talon Manual. We see additional support for the proposition that understanding technology is an ethical requirement. You'll see, for those of you who still have the Talon 1.0, the rule is is Rule 24. For those of you who Amazon has actually delivered your 2.0 version, that's Rule 85, and it talks about criminal responsibility or the responsibility of commanders. The Talon Manual recognizes that this is an extraordinarily complex and difficult area when it comes to technology, and it goes on to recognize that commanders can rely on a subordinate's knowledge in this area. But it doesn't let the commanders off the hook. It indicates that a commander has to have some amount of responsibility for understanding the cyber operations, and that we cannot rely wholly on a subordinate's knowledge. I would ask that if our commanders are expected to have some amount of reasonable understanding of the technology, then clearly I would submit the attorneys need to understand that too. I think that's also supported by another rule within the Talon Manual. Under 1.0 is Rule 48, and under the current 2.0 is Rule 110. And it discusses an attorney's responsibility for conducting a legal review. And in that, it contemplates the notion that attorneys would necessarily need to understand the technical data in order to develop a satisfactory weapons review in the cyber arena. So both the model ABA rules, as well as I believe the Talon rules, lead to a proposed comment that I think we should submit to the ABA to add to Rule 1.1 that specifically pertains to our understanding of technology. And such a rule might read like this: to be competent in the law or in the area of national security, one must maintain a working understanding of systems and technological advancements. Well, I can hear grumblings from over in the room next door who decided not to come fill in some of the empty spaces that we currently have, given the ethics brief. And you're saying something like this: "Oh, come on, Linell, that's easy for you to say. I read your bio. You're an astronautical engineering major. I went to law school got my degree in public policy because I abhor math. I never actually want to look at another math equation." Well, I think this actually might be easier than we might think at first blush. You don't have to have taken advanced math or engineering math to understand the technology that we're talking about here. And so I'd like to share a little bit about an approach that I took when I attended this school a couple years back. It's the Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Policy. For many of you in the room, you may have referred to it as ICAF. We're still trying to get the name. It's Eisenhower now. And I was fortunate enough to be placed in a seminar during that year that was entitled the Robotics and Autonomous Systems Seminar. So there were 15 of us. It was myself and a whole bunch of operators from all over the Joint Force, to include a general from the Israeli Army. They had all done something about autonomous vehicles. They'd flown them, they'd commanded them. I was the only lawyer in the room. And to tell you the extent of my technical competence was that I could spell UAV, and that was about it. So how did I go from day one to becoming a meaningful contributing member of that seminar? Well, I'll walk you through the steps that I took, and hopefully they might be applicable in your world or your work with cyber, or whatever the technological advancement that you may be working on in an area of national security law. I'll walk through the steps that I took, as well as hopefully you'll see some of the overlap between autonomy and cyber. And if we accept the proposition that the ethics rules require that we understand something about technology, then if we discuss something about technology, ergo, you're going to fulfill the rest of your ethics requirement through the rest of our time here today. So, step one, you need to understand the basic terms. For me, in entering into this seminar, I first had to understand, is there a difference between a robot and an autonomous system? And what's the difference between a robot and a machine? I quickly learned that robotics engineers are all over the map. You ask a dozen of them, and you'll get a dozen or more definitions of what a robot is. But you'll get the helpful beeping type, like R2-D2 in Star Wars, or the lovable but tough Baymax in Big Hero 6, or the frightening one in Terminator. But what makes a robot, vice a simple machine? Well, at its basic essence, a robot is a machine that senses, that thinks, and that acts in the real world. A robot senses its physical environment as well as its internal state, and armed with that information, a robot is then capable of making a decision about those inputs and taking some sort of action in the world. Robotics engineers call those things on the end of robots end effectuators, I learned. And they do something physical in the world, or they travel to a different point or space. Traveling in engineering speak is called locomotion. They try to make it as difficult as possible to understand what they're talking about. I next had to understand what's the difference between automation, we actually heard automation referred to in the last panel, versus autonomy. Well, automation is simply making a machine do a particular process, often one that a human had done in the past. Autonomy, on the other hand, denotes a system capable of operating independently, making its own decisions without direct human supervision for some period of time. There's a famous American roboticist named George Becky who described autonomous robots as simply, quote, intelligent machines capable of performing tasks in the world by themselves. Thus, the difference between a machine and a robot with some amount of autonomy is that a machine's actions are controlled and designed by a human, whereas an autonomous vehicle, the machine actually controls some of its own actions, makes a plan, and then executes that plan without human oversight. Autonomous systems, in essence, have the ability to make an independent decision and then act upon them. So after you understand some of the basic definitions, I found that the next helpful step is to keep a running list of acronyms. This was, no kidding, a conversation I walked into with a very good friend of mine, a Marine aviator, who then got into the autonomy field. I got lost somewhere in the first sentence. Maybe you are better, and you can make it to maybe sentence 2 or 3, but this was what my life was like at Eisenhower for an entire year. So I found that you literally had to stop, write down the acronym, and then write down what does it mean in order to just stay involved in the conversation. Engineers are no different. They have their own type of acronyms and speak that we have to understand if we're going to stay involved in the conversation. Well, quite frankly, these first 2 steps are easy to understand. Here's the catch. You have to accept the fact, especially you lawyers in the room, that you're not the smartest person in the room. If you're going to successfully execute these 2 steps, you have to put aside and swallow some of your pride and ask some questions that might reveal your ignorance. So these are the questions that I'd recommend that you ask, not on month 2 of your involvement in a project, but instead on day 1. When you said this, what did you mean? Do you have a cheat sheet of acronyms that I might be able to use? Is there something I can read to understand this system's capabilities? Or how does this system compare with another system with which I may be familiar? It is only when we allow ourselves to let down our guard and ask some fundamental questions about technology that we can begin to be part of the conversation, and I believe that we can begin to fulfill our ethical requirements of competency in the area of national security law. Step 3, understanding classifications. And no, I don't expect that you can read all of these small things. This slide is to illustrate that you need to understand what kind of categorizations or classifications does your particular brand of technology use. In autonomy, we often hear things about levels of autonomy, from full human control of a robot to semi-autonomous to full autonomy based on the amount of human interaction with the machine. Well, there's a catch. If we simply accept an engineer saying, oh, this is a semi-autonomous system, we haven't begun to understand what they mean by that. Why is that? Well, first, the level of autonomy realistically changes based on the subsystem, not the entirety of the system, but system by system within a weapons system. The level of autonomy is going to change. It may also change depending on which part of the mission it is executing or the environment in which the mission is being executed. This is complicated by the fact that the Department of Defense has not established a uniform definition or approach to autonomy levels. It was so bad that the Defense Science Board in 2012 recommended that DoD abandon this language of level of autonomy altogether. DoD has not implemented nor accepted that recommendation, and so we continue to see a myriad of approaches to levels of autonomy throughout the Department of Defense studies and reports. So as no uniform approach or definition has been accepted, I would encourage you to ask some questions about the type of autonomy that's being used. And we'll review 3 different approaches that are taken. One that we see up here is out of the 2011 DoD Unmanned Systems Integrated Roadmap, and it views level of autonomy through a human approach. It looks at the amount of human interaction in the level of decision that's being made. Human operated, where the human makes all of the decisions. Human delegated, where a system can perform those types of actions that a human has allowed it to make. Human supervised, where the unmanned system conducts an array of activities under the supervision of a human operator. Or fully autonomous, where the system functions completely independent of the human. But there's another framework, and one that engineers would much rather use, and that's the one down here in this bottom left. It's called the Autonomy Levels for Unmanned Systems, or ELFIS. And that takes a look at a 3D axis, where we look at the levels and the changing of autonomy based on the particular system and how it operates both in the environmental difficulty, the mission complexity, and the amount of human interaction, recognizing that depending on where we are in this 3D model really is dependent on what type or level of autonomy we're actually achieving. And then there's the final way that is being used, a third framework that looks very similar, if you will, to this first roadmap that was used, but it looks from through the lens of the machine as opposed to the human. And it looks at the potential autonomy that a machine might undertake. And that is known then as the non-contextual autonomy potential model. So why does all of this classification matter? Well, when we look at DoD policy, it makes quite clear that DoD may not design nor operate a fully autonomous system absent SecDef authority, both on the design as well as the implementation. If an engineer just says, oh, this is a semi-autonomous system, and we don't understand what exactly the approach to autonomy definitions that they are using, we are not able to satisfy, I think, our legal responsibility to evaluate whether or not or what a semi-autonomous system truly means. Given the variety of approaches, I would recommend that attorneys and policymakers and decision makers not accept semi-autonomous at face value, but instead ask engineers a variety of questions such as, how would you describe the range of the levels of autonomy that this system might possess? What's the potential autonomy that exists given an environmental complexity or change in a mission? And how exactly have these levels of autonomy been tested? These and other questions can only begin to be asked if we understand the basics of the type of categorizations that are used in the first place. So once you've understood the basic terminology or categorizations that may be used in your given technology, it's time to understand how it all works. Within each new technology, I believe that there are principal building blocks to understand the basics. In cyber, for example, if you're going to be a true cyber law expert, you probably need to understand how the internet works. You need to understand the basics of computer programming and why it matters if a given language is used, whether a system can defend itself, and recognize what the error rate is in coding. It's 1 error per every 1,500 lines, by the way. How does that impact or affect an individual's legal review if we should estimate that we're going to have errors in code? Now, you may be asking yourself, where do I get such basics in cyber? Well, I'm going to ask Lieutenant Colonel Biller to raise your hand. He is currently at the Stockton Center up at the Naval War College, and he and his colleagues are actually compiling a variety of areas within cyber that lawyers should understand and put it into lawyer speak. And so I hope he gets swamped at the end of this with a request for his email so that we can all stay in touch and begin to understand the basic building blocks that we need to in order to be competent in this area. For autonomy, I would submit that you need to understand some basics about control theory, about what a system's perceptual space is, or what I just said. What does that mean? We'll talk about it a little bit. A little bit about machine learning and machine reasoning. We're not going to get through all of those topics here today. I can hear the breath of relief at this point. But we are going to go through the first one, and that's control theory. And we're going to dive right in at its most basic. Control theory is simply decision-making that occurs within a system. And control theory is the mathematical and engineering study of how automated control systems work. More specifically, a control process in a system evaluates a number of variables and then selects some action in order to achieve a desired end state or goal. Now, before everyone starts to tune out, I promise you can understand this. You've actually, all the uniformed members in this room, have studied this. It's in every professional military education. We think about control theory like Colonel John Boyd did in the OODA loop. The OODA loop, the idea of observe, orient, decide, and act, is a great analogy to control theory. A system must first observe and collect data, and then synthesize that data into something the system can use or make sense of. Think of it as creating a perceptual space. Then in the decision phase, the system needs to compare that representation that it created to what it expected should be happening and make a choice in what action to take in order to get to its desired outcome or goal. So what does this look like? Let's go back to the control theory. This is what it looks like in math and engineering terms, except we throw in a bunch of terms like controller and processor and feedback loops. This type of control loop is called a closed loop, and a complex robot will literally have thousands of these control loops. A variety of feedback methods are available to an engineer, and the methodology literally takes place here in this little this box here, and it can be a proportional control, it could be a derivative control, it could be an integrated control system, all of which are well beyond the scope of this talk here today. But it's important to note that when robot controllers are making decisions, the controller is basing that decision based on its understanding of its perceptual space. In other words, what does this room look like to a robot? It's imperative that we as attorneys and policymakers understand what a robot or an autonomous system perceptual space might look like. Let's take an easy example, a robot that has one sensor. Let's give a robot one sensor that's a thermodynamic imager. In other words, it takes temperatures of this room. It would see this room by degrees of gradients in heat. What it would not see are things like vision or distance or rate of speed. In reality, robots have a multitude of sensors, and what we also need to understand as attorneys is that those sensors may be beyond what we as humans see, go beyond a visual spectrum and include things like infrared or radio frequency detection. So we need to understand what a robot's actual perceptual space looks like, and then we need to understand how a controller might make a decision about what action or choice to make. This control feedback loop that we see is easy if it's only governing one outcome, if it only has one choice to make. Think about a thermostat. That's a control feedback loop that when it gets too hot, it turns the heat off, or when it gets too cold, it turns the heat back on. But in reality, robots and autonomous systems have multiple controllers that are operating at the same time to balance multiple and sometimes conflicting outcomes it can get complex pretty quickly. So how does a robot use those sort of rules or constraints in governing its system? That's something that engineers call control architecture. The types of control architecture allow a robot to plan its next action by considering the outcomes of possible actions and deciding which course or plan is best to achieve its desired state. As the environment in which the robot operates grows in complexity and the number of those decisions grow as well, it takes more time for a robot to find an optimized solution. There's 4 basic control architectures that exist: deliberative, reactive, hybrid, and behavioral. And by this point, you're asking yourself, why should I care? Why should I care about the type of control architecture that an engineer may choose? Well, let's put this in some terms that you might understand. Let's take an autonomous weapon system that uses a behavior-based control algorithm. Let's assume it's been programmed to not fire a weapon at a child. That's a behavior that the robot is told to perform, but it may also have a behavior that allows for it to fire at a person or an object that's firing at a friendly soldier. So what happens if the adversary is holding a child hostage? Which behavior is going to trump? How does the robot decide? Well, a robot can be designed to arbitrate between conflicting behaviors. That arbitration can be fixed or dynamic hierarchy that changes depending on the environment in which it's operating. This arbitration method of resolving conflicts between various control systems is known as a competitive theory. Alternatively, the robot could be designed by the engineers to follow a cooperative control model that selects the most appropriate behavior based on each behavior getting a vote in the process, a vote on the ultimate outcome. Engineers call this behavior fusion. But in order for you as an attorney to give sound legal advice concerning the legality of such a weapon system, you're going to have to understand not only the model that the robot has about its perceptual space, but the type of control that's being utilized. As many in this room know, one aspect of lethal force requires a reasonable belief that the target is a legal one. Such reasonableness is tied to how an autonomous system creates and then evaluates its representation of perceptual space. In other words, will an autonomous robot create a model map of a given target that differentiates between military and civilian to the same reasonableness standard that a human operator might? Likewise, with target selection, necessarily would require that an autonomous system be able to make decisions based on different and sometimes conflicting behaviors. In order for you as the attorney to evaluate the legality of such actions, you're going to have to understand how the robot reaches an optimized solution and whether and how a robot will resolve conflicts between competitive or with a cooperative control method. So what are some questions that you might ask? And you may ask, is this real? Well, it is. These are examples of UGVs that are being used. Some are Israeli models. I got the opportunity to go to Israel and happy to talk about some of that while I was at Eisenhower during Q&A. But you need to also be able to ask engineers questions about what's the system's perceptual space? What type of control algorithm is being used in this system, and why did you choose that one? What behaviors is this system trying to achieve, and how is it going to resolve conflicts between those behaviors? So it's this level of understanding that I would submit that we need to understand about the basic building blocks of autonomy. We could go through this exact same thing with respect to machine learning or machine reasoning. I've recently been working with an engineer to write a chapter about machine reasoning, how the differences between deductive and inductive and abductive models of reasoning and why that matters, not only for engineers, but quite frankly for regulators about where we place liability. When we understand the mechanics behind the technology, we can better opine and apply laws and regulations to make sense of this technology. I will say that it's going to require one additional step, and that step is that we need to start translating the Latin for the techies. We can no longer sit on our high horse and say that this is our realm and not those who have not graced the fine halls of Duke Law School. Instead, it is a realm that we need to share. I'll share a story as to why. I had an Air Force commander friend who was working on a paper concerning the overlap and the command responsibility of autonomous systems. I sent him a law review article that talked about what I thought was right on point. It talked about autonomy and commanders, and he's a smart guy. And he came to me and he said, "Do you lawyers intentionally write in a way that no one outside of your community can understand them?" For those non-lawyers, I see some shaking their head in the back. This comment illustrates the not-so-funny aspect of my opening joke. That in cyber and autonomy worlds, lawyers and policymakers need to be especially sensitive to the need to share a little bit of our world with operators and engineers. I reject wholeheartedly the notion that if we expose operators and engineers to the law, that they'll just be inclined to dispose of our expertise and answer the questions about legality for themselves. That would be as if all of you felt competent about control theory based on this presentation to go out and design a UAV yourself. It's just not going to happen. They need our expertise, but they also need to understand at least the basics of our world. To this end, I recommend that attorneys provide engineers an overview of overarching bodies of law applicable to the use of force, detailed principles that must be evaluated for determining when a weapon is legal and if a weapon is legal to employ in certain particular circumstances. If designers understand the requirements up front, they can better build and develop compliance systems and become knowledgeable about the type of technical and test data that we as attorneys need to do our part in legal reviews. To this end, I recently wrote a Law for Dummies article about autonomy, and I chose not to publish it with the Air Force Law Review, no offense, but instead I published it with IEEE, with the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. And then I went to their conference at the International Conference of UAS and talked with engineers about this is what the law is going to require in autonomy. We need to do more of that cross-pollination. And be forewarned, I also gave those engineers questions to ask you as lawyers. Questions like, will this autonomous weapon system ever need to engage a target outside of an armed conflict? They now understand why that matters and what that might do to their approach in designing. There are a whole host of questions that engineers and operators should be asking us from the outset, and they can only ask these questions if they understand a little bit more about our world. The questions go on, by the way. So, while robotics engineers would be the first to admit that their ability to develop a fully autonomous weapon system that is capable of identifying, selecting, and then engaging an enemy target without human interaction is in the distant future, the need to understand how autonomy and cyber and international law coincide, that need exists today. For lawyers to provide sound advice on this topic, they cannot simply have a general overview of a system's capabilities. Attorneys and policymakers must immerse themselves in the technical details of why robots work the way they do, why cyber weapons work the way they do, what technical limitations they possess, and why. Likewise, engineers must embrace the full, rich understanding of international law principles to develop more capable systems that comply with global norms. Well, much of my remarks today were based on a research that I had the opportunity to do while I was at Eisenhower. I'm glad DJAG, General Rockwell, has actually left the building because I now get to talk about that the Air Force paid me for almost an entire year. I get to sit in the Library of Congress in their main reading room. For those of you who have been blessed to see it, it's an amazing thing. And I noticed towards the end of my research and studies that there had been a quote emblazoned above me by Sir Francis Bacon, a noted scientist and philosopher, and it read, "The inquiry, knowledge, and belief of truth is the sovereign good of human nature." For all the debate about killer robots and the legal and ethical implications of autonomous and cyber weapon systems on the battlefield, I personally remain confident that mankind will find an acceptable path that is both legal and ethical. But that path will only be found, I believe, when engineers and lawyers and policymakers begin to speak the same language. And if they speak that same language, they might just happen to get through those pearly gates. With that, I would love to answer whatever questions that you may have.
Linell, normally I would help you answer or choose the people, but I'm not capable, so.
We've talked him out, so he's.
And I'm sure you can do it better than I.
Certainly.
Right, Madeline?
You definitely notice my, I guess, reaction to that statement about the law needing to shift and the law needing to become more accessible to everyone. It's been a concept that's been around since 1932 with the statute of pleading. There's Jeremy Bentham speaking about the literary garbage of law and this need for it to change. Why do you think there's been this technology change will push the law to change?
Well, it's certainly my hope, and in part because the need for it is so different. When we start designing or thinking about artificial intelligence or autonomous systems, we're designing systems now that are going to be able to think for themselves, and not just think, but act. If we're going to allow that to happen, then that discussion, that design is incumbent upon us to ensure that that design includes, by necessity, the laws of war, or if it's being operated outside of a military system. We heard actually in the panel yesterday quite a bit about artificial intelligence, and that the artificial intelligence, for example, may be a panacea of an approach for cybersecurity, the ability for systems to sort of think for themselves and thwart what might be an attack on them. I'd be cautious in that approach, mainly because we need to understand, for example, what does machine learning mean? How do we teach a system right from wrong? And the real trick in some of machine learning is how do you get a machine to actually credit the right action for that right or wrong decision? I'll give an example. I've got my freshman here. If she were to study for a test and cram the night before and then get a good grade on that test, she might impermissibly credit the last-minute studying to getting a good grade, as opposed to what I happen to know is her taking diligent notes in all of her classes and doing copious amounts of homework in between swim sets. So how do we teach a machine what thing to credit? It is those types of, this idea that machines are going to move beyond ourselves, this idea that machines are going to be able to think and make choices, that we've got to design. It's not enough that operators use them in a legal manner. We have to build it in from the beginning. And so that's, in answer to your question, my hope that we have law and that we start to explain that with the scientists and the engineers that are developing this early and up front, because we have to. So.
Hi, Colonel. My background is a former naval officer in program management from the defense acquisition perspective. So not legally schooled, but Fort Belvoir DAU schooled. Then I spent 13 years with the Marine Corps as a civilian, as a program manager, very heavily from 2002 to 2015. I think I understand all your points from an acquisition perspective, but I'm also quite comforted, but at least from the Navy and what I know of the other services, with the acquisition review boards, which in many ways they are beneficial to compliance with such issues, even with arms control. I mean, as legitimized by treaties, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, START, Chemical Weapons Convention, classic international treaties to which we signed up. I feel fairly confident by watching the Marine Corps deal with UAVs and the fact that they've used the Naval Air Systems Command, like other systems commands within DoD, that they have been fully compliant to the best of their knowledge with the international aspects of such things as I think the RQ-7 is the Shadow, and the next one's called the Blackjack. And in fact, they've got trained program managers at NAVAIR, that are colonels in the Marine Corps, that help ferret through the legal complexities to include seeking guidance from Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, Acquisition to help them with these decisions. Your perspective comes across from needing a better dialogue with engineers, but do you feel there's a conflict between what we currently are doing as program managers versus the knowledge? That's really kind of my background question.
That's an excellent question concerning this idea that are we talking enough with the acquisition types? I think we do talk enough with our acquisition counterparts about, as you mentioned, the laws and the treaties. I think where the acquisition policymakers, and something that we looked at quite extensively, and Eisenhower looks at this a great deal, is that our methods and approaches to acquisition may need to fundamentally change based on how rapidly this cyber and autonomy are the turn rate, if you will, and especially when you compare private sector methodologies and their ability to research and design and turn systems into to marketplace ideas. They're moving so quick that our acquisition structure really limits us. And so I would say that while I think on the one hand, the acquisition and the dialogue between attorneys and acquisition attorneys and program managers is very good, I think we need to start having that dialogue together as a group with the engineers about what are some of those fundamental policy changes that we need to make about our acquisition system in order to allow for that turn that we're going to need in order to stay up to speed on our weapons systems and developments.
You talked a lot about the knowledge level that lawyers need to have. Do you have any practical suggestions about how to achieve it? And are there things going on out at the academy to try to make that?
I'll have to pay you later, sir. So one of the things that we're doing at the Air Force Academy, the question was, are there any practical applications of this where we can start looking at the technology? In addition to what I mentioned that the Stockton Center is doing on cyber, the Air Force Academy, and particularly within the Department of Law this summer, is going to stand up a research cell that's entitled Law, Technology, and Warfare. And in doing this, we hope to start this very type of dialogue, not just with attorneys, but quite frankly, with our soon-to-be second lieutenants who are going through the Air Force Academy, as well as the other academies with Naval Academy and West Point. West Point has something similar with respect to land warfare and technology that is up within their law department, so we're a little late to the game, but we're going to plan to play catch-up. We're going to do this in a number of ways. Number one, we're going to reach out and work with our LLM students who are about to go off and go study. Oftentimes we hear from our LLMers when they get up to the point of having to write a thesis, they don't know what to write on. So we plan to establish a group of experts across the JAG Corps to provide some input and some guidance on technology areas that may allow for additional scholarship in this area. The other exciting part is that we plan to use cadets to further this interest. Not all cadets who go through our legal studies program are going to become lawyers, otherwise they'd probably fire me. But we have a great number who are going to be operators. And so for those cadets, we are looking, for example, this summer, one sophomore to be rising junior is going to spend a summer at NSA. He'll have all of his clearances as a result, and then the next summer we hope to embed him after he's taken a cyber law class and some more international law classes. We hope to embed him with a legal office within DoD to further the study of the interrelation between technology and cyber, and then bring him back to go and work with other departments across the academy, to work with the engineers who are going through a EE program, and to work with them on their capstone projects, to continue to develop an overarching understanding of the technology and allow us at the beginning, before they even pin on their butter bars, to start having discussions and dialogue across the different disciplines, so that they start early, that this becomes something that is the norm for them, as opposed to getting in their stovepipes and sending an email for a request for a legal review. That instead we start with this notion that we need to work together. The Academy also is, in the area of cyber, is just standing up something called CyberWorks, which is a DARPA-like entity, if you will, for the Air Force to ask questions and solve questions that folks at the headquarters air staff are asking, and to allow an entity with to create public-private partnerships with different corporations. CyberWorks is a really exciting aspect, a new center that's being stood up within the Academy. I expect, and in full advertisement, once the freeze lifts for the civilian hire, that there may be a cyber law position that will be within CyberWorks. So for those of you interested in coming to Colorado Springs, this is an unsolicited endorsement that we may have a job for you. But it's an exciting area, and I think the more we at the research level, at the scholarship level, begin to approach problems from an interdisciplinary perspective, the more likely we are to continue to resolve those types of problems in that manner in the future.
Colonel, thank you for a very interesting presentation. A question from someone who's neither a lawyer nor an engineer. Your comments highlight the need for lawyers and engineers to talk to each other, in part in order to ensure that there is an ethical approach towards autonomy. I guess my question is, one, whose ethics? Mm-hmm. By that I don't mean lawyers versus engineers, but my background's on China, and so I would ask whether or not we aren't, in a sense, opening the doors to one of the things that General Dunlap has written about, which is legal warfare. That while we are busily trying to make sure that any robots that we produce will go forth and operate in loops that are consistent with our ethics, that there may well be other folks whose first question is, how many GIs will this kill? Because that's what matters. And if there's anything that gets in the way, well, that's their problem. And to what extent does, by incorporating all of these considerations, which is consistent with our ethical framework, are we nonetheless opening up? The previous panel talked a lot about how the EU was talking about human rights in cyber and surveillance and all that. And we talked very briefly offline there about whether or not the EU ever asked about Chinese surveillance and whether that was consistent with human rights. And so I guess the question here is whether or not we are opening up the door, precisely because we've had this conversation, for the Chinese to basically say, you are unethical. You, the United States, are producing unethical robots. And perhaps the EU will say, yes, that's correct, because you have gone to the trouble of trying to think this through. But we'll let the Chinese have a pass. I was wondering if you could address that a little bit.
So I think there's obviously, and General Dunlap has written on this quite extensively, a difference between what is required from a legal construct versus what is required ethically. And I don't know if George Lucas is still here, if he had to go out to catch a flight, but he is one who has written not only extensively on cyber ethics in his new book, but has talked about military ethics writ large, as well as a number of other individuals who are talking more about the ethical role and in the execution or the implementation of these. I think you're absolutely right that the differences of approaches between different geographical areas is radical. I saw that firsthand when I went to Israel. Their use of and willingness to use autonomous systems is remarkably more forward-leaning than some of our own. Some of those UGVs that we indicated that we're up on are the one in the bottom right corner. That's an Israeli UGV. They use it to actually patrol their boundaries and their borders. They're not building a wall. They're just having the UAVs patrol and decide when to shoot. Now, there are humans in the loop on that, but that begs the question concerning which ethics and in what way are we using that autonomous system? Is it in an armed conflict, or is it in more of a law enforcement capacity? And how does that change? You're absolutely correct that there are different philosophies about an ethical construct and approach. I think that is one of the reasons that lawyers and philosophers need to talk more as well in terms of, but we also need to be very clear in differentiating and not confusing, at least for our warfighter, that we are not here to debate the ethical construct. We are here to follow the law. And if we've done so, then we don't want our warfighters, quite frankly, questioning whether or not it's right to pull the trigger, especially if we've been very clear in what our ROEs are. So I think you raise an interesting point that will continue, and I think we see that reflected, quite frankly, in the Stop Killer Robot campaign. In large part, though, I think we see that because there's a misunderstanding about what does autonomy mean and whether or not we can actually regulate it and design it in such a way to satisfy some of those ethical requirements. So, interesting question. You can take your pick.
So I never practiced military law, let alone cyber law, but a couple of your principles on having to educate yourself in technology and communicating with your clients strangely resonated. And I'm curious as to your experience that when you would have to get down to learn the technical matters enough to be able to effectively advise the experts, did you sometimes find that it could actually be the weakness of not knowing ahead of time and not being an expert could actually be a strength in that the true experts were so into their silo that they wouldn't necessarily have a broader perspective, that paradoxically your ignorance, in a sense, could actually help you see things in a way that you could help them see the forest, not just the trees?
No, I think that's an interesting question. I think that also, if we get to the basics and we ask what for experts would be incredibly simple questions, right? That it forces them to stop and think for a moment about, oh, well, I hadn't really thought about that. And so I think that's an interesting insight. I was pleased. I was talking with Colonel Korn earlier today, and he talked about someone who's working in his shop who has both an engineering background as well as is going through law school. And that ability to have some of those experts who can bridge both worlds, I think, are important. But sometimes, to your point, asking the naive question may actually give pause to the engineers as well, but only if we ask the questions, right? So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Linell. I think that's a good example of the cutting edge thinking that we in this community need to do. You know, this is not your grandfather's ethics presentation, which we've seen many times. And Howard, to your point, I do recall, General Wells, I think, knows what I'm talking about. I was deployed for an operation in a command center, combat operation, an air operation. And in the middle of the operation, the general turned and asked me a question in fighter pilot talk, which is not English, by the way, not even. And it was a very complicated question where you really did have to know a lot about airplanes and how fighter pilots communicate, which they learn because they have to compress their speech and be able to communicate under high stress. And afterwards, I was talking to him. I said, you know, it was a really hard question for me. He said, yeah, I was testing you. Because if you had answered wrong, you were out of this air operation. I was going to get somebody else. Because this is what's at stake at this level. You know, we're talking about killing people. We're talking about preserving our national security. So that's why what what Linell's talking about is so critically important, because once you lose the confidence of the client, there's no coming back, in my experience. We have come to the end of our conference. I can't tell you how grateful I am that you all have come and continue to support our conference here. I do want to, if we have some of our, I'd like some of our volunteers to come back in. Because really, without and this is just a sampling of our volunteers, without them, this would not happen, because it is a very complex operation, as you might imagine. And I just want to give them a hand, and I hope you join me. And I really want to thank our speakers. We have some of them who are still here, because as you might be able to tell, I am very, very selective about who we have as speakers, because there are a lot of really smart people out there, but they can't execute in a way that's going to communicate to an audience like this. Unfortunately, this year I got all the first picks. They all said yes, much to my surprise, and I really appreciate it. We are going to be sending. We can always do better. We're going to be sending out to you by email a survey, and this is the centerpiece of our support, Victoria. Any of you communicated with her? She had to put up with my instinct for micromanagement, which is not easy to deal with. But we are going to be going out with the survey. Tell us how we can do better, and particularly I'm interested in your thoughts on what we ought to do next year, because we're going to take a day off and then we'll start thinking about next year. Again, one of the main reasons why I want to continue doing this is it's great that we have all the information and so forth, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to get together and see old friends and make new friends, and especially because of the kind of audience we have. We have lawyers, we have law students, we have retirees, we have operators. This is really what we need to do in this national security law area. So thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you next year.